My name's Brad Stevens. I'm a regular contributor to Sight and Sound and author of books on Abel Ferrara and Monty Hellman.
And I'm R. Dixon Smith, author of Ronald Colman, Gentleman of the Cinema. I'm a film historian with an interest in German silent cinema and early German talkies. Brad and I will be talking today about F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. Nosferatu is a Romanian word which means undead. Nosferatu is a figure from the realm between light and death. The score for this film has never been heard before on DVD. It was written by Hans Erdmann for the original 1922 release of Nosferatu. Hans Erdmann wrote the original score for Nosferatu in 1922. He composed other scores, including Fritz Lang's last German film, Das Testament des Dr. Mabuse. Henrik Gallain, who scripted Nosferatu, also scripted 2 years earlier Paul Wegener's Der Golem, and Alban Grau designed the sets and costumes.
And the film was adapted from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, but it was in fact an unofficial, indeed an illegal adaptation, because Murnau had not attained the rights, and so he changed the names of all the characters. Dracula became Count Orlok, Jonathan Harker became Jonathan Hutter, and so on. And in fact, the versions that were distributed in the West with English intertitles went back to the names from Stoker's novel. But the version you're seeing now has the original intertitles with the names chosen by Murnau.
One interesting thing to talk about first, I think, is the fact that Nosferatu is a very important German expressionist classic. But was F.W. Murnau an expressionist director? I think not. I think he used expressionist devices in his films because they were very strong, dramatic symbols, visual symbols. He was trained as an art historian at the University of Heidelberg. Murnau was a romantic poet. He gave us probably the most overwhelming and poignant images in all German cinema. He came out of that romantic tradition. Think of Caspar David Friedrich, for instance. Murnau never gave us mere decorative stylization, but if you look at some of the images shot on location in Nosferatu, it's easy to realize this is not the product of an expressionist director per se, but rather a romantic director, a director coming from the heavy German romantic tradition of the 19th century. The film was made by Prana Film. It was the only film they made. There was very little money to spend on this project. It was a low-budgeted film. The money was so tight, for instance, that they could not afford to pay for the rights to Bram Stoker's novel. We'll talk later about the fact that they got into a lot of trouble.
And here we see the introduction of Professor Bulwer, who is the equivalent of the novel's Van Helsing. And in the novel, Van Helsing is a major character and, in fact, becomes Dracula's antagonist. Murnau turns him into a rather bumbling, ineffectual old man who has very little to do except offer some spectacularly unhelpful advice to Hutter, the Jonathan Harker character. Not so fast, my young friend. No one outruns his destiny.
Because there was so little money to spend on sets, Murnau turned to location. They went to Wismar, which became Visborg in the film. They used Baltic townscapes, and for the Transylvania sequences of the film, they shot in Czechoslovakia.
I think you can see in this scene why people link Nosferatu with the expressionist tradition. On the whole, Murnau prefers to use natural landscapes, but here the sets are just not quite right. The chair is too high, the desk is too high. It's just a little bit heightened. This is one of the few overtly expressionist elements in the film.
Yes, it is an expressionist film. I would question, rather, whether Murnau should be considered an expressionist director. Faust, for instance, is an expressionist film. Sunrise, on the other hand, made in Hollywood, is not an expressionist film. It is a film that uses a lot of expressionist devices. Perhaps most importantly, the heavy, lumbering, almost Emil Jannings-like way that George O'Brien lumbers through the earlier scenes in the film. Murnau is known to have suggested to O'Brien that he use heavy weights in the bottoms of his shoes to make it very difficult for him to pick up his feet when he walked. That's an expressionist device that suggests heaviness, doom-laden acting, but Sunrise is not an expressionist film. Nosferatu, on the other hand, is an expressionist film, but not made by a director who chiefly made expressionistic films.
And here we see the house that is going to be sold to Count Orlok, Nosferatu, and we're told that it's directly opposite Jonathan Hutter's house. So already, Murnau, even before he's actually introduced Count Orlok, is establishing that Orlok is in some respects a mirror image or doppelganger of Hutter. Remember the first time we saw Hutter, he was looking in a mirror. Here, as so often in Murnau, we have the innocent heterosexual couple whose happiness is threatened by a single powerful individual. It's a structure that recurs in Tartuffe, in Faust, in Sunrise, and supremely in his final film, Taboo. Hutter here displays the energy of an adolescent. There's something almost pre-sexual about it. We never really feel that his relationship with Ellen is a sexual relationship. He's almost like a child. And Ellen here seems peculiarly lacking in vitality, a strong contrast with her husband. It's almost as if the threat represented by Nosferatu, Count Orlok, is already somehow present in their relationship.
With Ellen, perhaps preternaturally aware of it, aware of its future coming, but Hutter not at all aware of it yet, not until he makes the journey to Transylvania.
And there's a suggestion that Count Orlok is the embodiment of something, some perhaps sexual element, which is missing or repressed in the marriage. And here, when we see the exterior of Hutter's house, it's very neat, very well ordered, these smooth curves, these straight lines. This is the world of logic from which Hutter is about to depart. And the landscape through which he moves becomes progressively disordered, as if he's moving into repressed realms of his own consciousness.
He is about to move into the supernatural. He is about to move into what Bela Balash called the glacial drafts of air from the beyond. He is on his way to Transylvania and Graf Orlok.
And here even the tree seems somehow to be sheltering the house, and yet there's something not quite right, something disturbing about it. Already the straight lines are being broken, even at the point of his departure. There's just a slight suggestion, a slight ambiguity.
He has now left his ordered, structured world and is about to venture into a nightmare, a supernatural nightmare. And here we see the hills, the forests, the lowering storm clouds, the great shadows of the supernatural. The scene we are looking at now, we have seen refilmed many times over in later versions of Dracula. But this was the first time. Harker, here rendered as Hutter, enters, and the moment he tells the landlord where he is going, jaws drop, spoons drop. It has become a cliche over the last 70 or 80 years, but this is the very first time. They know what he does not yet know, that he is about to take his life into his own hands by meeting Count Orlok.
I think contemporary audiences probably have a tendency to laugh at this scene, and particularly at the rather broad playing of the actor who plays Hutter. But if we do laugh at this scene, it's probably because Murnau intends us to laugh. We're supposed to find Hutter's behavior kind of amusing in its naivete.
To a degree, though, Brad, I think we're laughing at the frightened reactions of the locals when they hear where Hutter is going. And I think that cliche is what prompts modern laughter. It wasn't a cliche when Murnau filmed it.
Here, behind the bed, we see the introduction of the arch shape, which will turn up at many points in the film, and will usually be associated with Count Orlok. Here, interestingly enough, on its first appearance, it's associated with Hutter. And so already, again, before we've actually met Count Orlok, there's a suggestion that the two characters are somehow connected, are somehow mirror images.
A hyena thrown in for good measure. Creepier, more supernatural in a way, more an omen of doom, of destruction, perhaps of sharp teeth.
It's worth remembering that one of the first shots of the film showed Ellen teasing a kitten with a piece of string. That was the first reference to nature in the film. But as the film progresses, the references to nature become more menacing, less controllable, and will, of course, culminate in the introduction of Count Orlok, a representative of nature who will not be teased with a piece of string. But it's a double-edged irony, because ultimately Orlok will be defeated by Ellen. So there is a sense in which she manipulates him as shamelessly as she manipulates the cat. Now, Bram Stoker's novel was entirely narrated as a series of journal entries, letters, diary entries. The use of these written texts in Murnau's film kind of relates to that. Not exactly, because there are no exact equivalents to these texts in the novel, but the idea is basically the same, a series of written texts guiding us through the narrative.
Here is a perfect evocation of the romantic style in German painting from the 19th century. It's impossible for me to look at the image we've just seen without thinking of Friedrich, Caspar David Friedrich.
Again here, the clear use of the arch. And nature here, something quite peaceful, horses running free.
A contrast perhaps to what is about to come very soon after.
This very broad performance where he can't just put the book down, he has to throw it down.
Yes.
These gestures that are so strongly stressed.
Yes.
And again, if we find this funny, I think we're supposed to find it funny because it's such a total contrast with what will become of Hutter. All of this childish, youthful energy will disappear.
Yes, he's a naif. He has looked out the window and seen the light. He picks up the book, which suggests darkness. He can't grasp. He's too naive to grasp the darkness, so he throws it down. But look at those lowering clouds. Look at the formidable mountain crags. We are entering nightmare territory now, although Hutter doesn't yet realize it. He's about to realize it in a few moments.
And whereas a classic expressionist film such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari made use of completely artificial sets to represent mental states, here Murnau manages to do the same things with absolutely natural landscapes.
That is a horrific image. It is not an expressionist image.
And you notice when they cross the bridge just shakes slightly. Just a suggestion that Hutter is heading into a world which is not based on such solid foundations, the world of the subconscious.
Another image which later became a cliché. The driver will not take him beyond this point, out of fear. Hutter The naïf laughs at the reluctance, doesn't see it coming.
Another bridge image, the idea of crossing bridges. Again, a natural landscape used for symbolic effect. I think it's difficult to put ourselves into the minds of an audience that was seeing this film when it first came out. You know, now, as you say, all of these events are cliches. It's very difficult to imagine what it must have been like to see this without knowing what was going to happen.
And here it's happening. This image is one of the most frightening carriage images the cinema has ever given us, except perhaps for Victor Sjöström's Phantom Carriage.
And note the use here of speeded up motion. And this is in fact the first appearance of Count Orlok, disguised as a coachman. And here there's almost the sense that Orlok has control not only over the characters but over the cinematic text. And his first appearance, suddenly we have speeded up motion, we have images in negative. It's as if the whole film's style changes as soon as Orlok appears.
Some commentators have criticized the fast motion, and especially right here, the use of a negative image as a clumsy piece of stylization. I don't see it that way at all. It is stylized. It's very heavily stylized. It is suggestive of a nightmare.
And it's not as if it's appearing at an arbitrary point. I mean, it's very clearly linked with the first appearance of Orlok.
Yes. Things move the way they move in a nightmare. They do not move the way they should move. We do not see negative images in real life, but perhaps they exist in the dream world. Another fast motion shot with the coachman driving away. But again, think of both the temporal and the spatial game Murnau is playing now. We saw Count Orlok driving away just a couple of shots ago, and there he is again. He couldn't have moved from point A to point C without going through point B, but he did skip point B. Suddenly, he's inside the castle.
My friend, the French critic Nicole Brunez, often talks about films in terms of their figural aspects. I think it would be very interesting to talk about Nosferatu from that perspective. It's almost as if Nosferatu, Count Orlok, occupies a different figural regime from the other characters. The other characters are only ever living bodies. Orlok can be anything. He can be human, half human, or animal. He can be solid or he can be transparent. He can be in this place and that place. He has a freedom which is lacking in the other characters. Again, the arch.
Disappearing into the nightmare.
Was this a set?
Yes, it was.
It's not clear to me how much he was using real locations. Here you can see the chair is just slightly too high. It's just a small expressionist touch.
Now, look at that face. There are those who compare and contrast Max Schreck with the more famous Bela Lugosi performance as Dracula. For my money, a figure who has lain in a coffin, moldering for years, if not centuries, is not going to be wearing a clean, shiny tuxedo. On the other hand, what he will be wearing has mold adhering to it for years, if not centuries. Look at that figure, look at that face, and look at that body. It's suggestive of contagion, contamination, desiccation. He's got the palpable stench of decay on him. Look at his hands. They're not hands, they're claws. He's got the pointed ears of a creature, and he's got positively rodent teeth.
The Dracula of Stoker's novel is never quite as grotesque as the Count Orlok of Murnau's film. On the other hand, he's never quite as romantic as the Bela Lugosi of Todd Browning's film. And here, the sense that Hutter feels that he's awakening perhaps from a dream, as if the events of the previous night were not quite real. But here even the sunlight seems somehow trapped.
Let's check the neck. Have I been visited by a plague, a pestilence? Have I been corrupted?
It's almost as if he understands that there is the possibility of him being bitten on the neck, even though it hasn't actually happened yet.
I've always assumed by the smile we see reflected in the mirror that he sees he has not been corrupted yet.
Again, the arch shape. About half the time the arch seems to be associated with Count Orlok, the other half it's associated with Hutter, though very clearly reinforcing the idea that these characters are somehow mirror images of each other.
We associate German Expressionism with studio sets, with constructed sets within the confines of a studio atmosphere. Here, we have an Expressionist film. Most of it is clearly expressionistic. The acting styles are frequently, especially Count Orlok, is a jerky, expressionistic acting style. But I believe the fact that we have such breathtaking locales has to do with the fact that there was no money to create elaborate studio sets.
That was Murnau's genius, that he could find these locations which would so clearly represent psychological states. Oh, there's a very interesting documentary which will be included on the DVD in which we see the locations that Murnau filmed at as they exist now. And they don't actually look that different.
They haven't changed much at all. Again, I cannot look at this image without thinking of Caspar David Friedrich. That is a lowering, frightening shot. Very oppressive, an extremely oppressive shot.
Now, Orlok here sees the image of Hutter's wife, Ellen, and immediately, for some reason, is attracted to her.
This vampire is palpably animalistic. He is not a human being. He is an animal. Look at those claws. No human being ever had claws like that, except, of course, Howard Hughes.
They were reminded that the house Orlok is buying is directly opposite Hutter's. And by this point, I think even Hutter recognizes that there is some... he has some strange relationship with Count Orlok. That the reason Orlok terrifies him is because what he sees when he looks at Orlok is a side of his own personality that he's not willing to confront, or not capable of confronting. Up to now, this has been a fairly faithful adaptation of the novel, but that will certainly change in the second half, and the changes that Murnau makes to Stoker's novel are quite intriguing. But up to now, this is a reasonably faithful adaptation. And we see that whenever Hutter is confronted by Orlok, all he can do is run, cringe back in terror. And in a sense, this evokes the first scene with Professor Bulwer, whose advice to Hutter was, "Not so fast, my young friend. No one outruns his destiny." And now we can clearly see that Hutter will make no attempt to outrun his destiny. All he can do is cower back and wait for destiny to arrive.
Look at that hairless dome. Look at those pointed ears. Look at those rodentine teeth. Look at those claws. That is an animal. That is a predatory animal.
And here Murnau introduces what will become the dominant theme of the film's latter stages, the connection between Count Orlok and Hutter's wife, Ellen. There's a sense that when she wakes up, it's almost as if she has dreamed the preceding events. And indeed, the relationship of those events to these characters is that of a dream. this amazing image of Nosferatu as Shadow. As they said, the other characters are only ever living bodies, but Nosferatu, Count Orlok, can be anything. He can be a body or a shadow.
This is one of the first major departures from the novel. Vampires do not cast shadows, do they?
That I'm not sure of.
They certainly do not show there is no reflection in a mirror, but do they cast shadows?
Perhaps they do.
Okay.
I don't know if that's established in the novel. Now, Andre Bazin once claimed that editing played no meaningful role in Murnau's films, but we can see that that's nonsense. The editing here is astonishing, almost as if Count Orlok is looking at Ellen, something that's suggested purely by patterns of editing. And I said earlier, with the use of speeded up motion and negative, there's a suggestion that Orlok can control the rules of the narrative. He can control the filmic devices. But there's the implication here that Ellen perhaps shares that power with him. The power to cross enormous distances by means of patterns of editing.
By the time Murnau made Nosferatu, he had already made a lot of motion pictures. Unfortunately, very few of them have survived. This is one of his earlier pictures to have survived. The earliest, I believe, are Schloss Vogelrud, which was made just before Nosferatu, Phantom, or Phantom, which was made just after Nosferatu, and Der brennende Acker, The Burning Earth, which was made, I believe, just after Nosferatu. After that point, most of Murnau's films have survived.
And Hutter, again, awakening. Perhaps from a dream, but by this point, he clearly could not convince himself that these events are not really happening. They clearly are happening, but they still have a dreamlike quality.
And again, he has reached for his neck. Have I been corrupted? Where is my host? It is daytime. My host is not up and about.
We never really get a sense of what Orlok's house looks like. We only ever see it in fragments. We see a doorway, we see a window, we see a corridor. But it's very much the realm of dreams, compared to the way that we saw Hutter's house earlier in the film. And again, when confronted with Orlok, all Hutter can do is cower back in terror.
Close-up of a predatory animal's teeth. This shot, I'm afraid, always produces laughter in modern audiences, from modern audiences.
Why do you think that is?
Most people don't ascend stairs on their bottoms. It is a faintly comical image, but I think the degree of laughter it produces in modern audiences is a bit inappropriate, given the atmosphere and given the nature of the scene. Count Orlov loading coffins to be transported to Visborg.
And again, the use of speeded up motion. Orlok clearly has total control even over the cinematic devices of the film. He has a power over the cinematic text which is denied the other characters. And even Hutter's attempt to actually do something instead of cowering in terror, his attempt to escape, takes the form of what almost seems to be a suicidal leap. It's one of the film's most beautiful images. Orlok's coffin being transported along the river. The scene is slightly longer than in most previously circulating versions. I think there's one additional shot. When Werner Herzog remade the film in the 1970s, he recreated this image quite precisely. Here we're back in the world of conventional normality, a world of clear lighting and straight lines. And notice the presence of the nun, a reference to the force of metaphysical good, as opposed to the metaphysical evil represented by Count Orlok. But it won't be the force of metaphysical good that defeats Orlok. Religion is quite powerless in this world.
How influential was Nosferatu at the start? Well, it's important to remember that Nosferatu was almost a lost film. It was yanked from circulation based on the lawsuit that Florence Stoker brought against Prana Film, its producer. The film was barely seen. By the time Todd Browning made Dracula for Universal, the only prints of Nosferatu that were in circulation were bootleg prints that tended to show at private film societies. There would have been many people in the film industry who had seen it when it first came out, but I think the influence of Nosferatu came later.
Here we see Orlok's coffin being loaded on board this ship that will take it to Hutter's home. There's these lamps which barely seem to penetrate the darkness. I disliked intertitles on the whole, and many of the intertitles in this film and his other films are rationalized. They're written documents, they're letters, they're entries in a journal, they're pages in a book about vampires.
The coffin is about to be loaded into the hold, and Count Orlok and his rats are about to be transported and taken to Visborg, where they can infest and infect the entire community.
And this idea of the monster being the bearer of plague, a plague which spreads and overtakes everything around it, this is an idea that recurs in several Murnau films, most powerfully in his final film, Taboo. Here we see Professor Bulwer, the equivalent of the Van Helsing character in the novel. I think it's important to point out that in Stoker's novel, Van Helsing is one of the major characters. The final scene of the novel has Van Helsing leading the other male characters in an attack on Dracula, the vampire, while Jonathan Harker's wife stands off to one side, watching from a safe distance. Here, Murnau makes this character a totally useless old man who really has nothing at all effective to contribute to the fight against the vampire. He's first seen telling Hutter not to try resisting his fate. He lectures on Venus flytraps. He has no function at the end of the film except as a kind of diversion. And the changes here are so extensive that it's almost possible to see the film as a critique of the assumptions made by Stoker. And I wonder if it was Murnau's homosexuality that encouraged him to reject the emphasis on male heroics in Stoker's novel. Though, of course, we now know that Stoker himself was homosexual. But it's interesting the way that Murnau ends up focusing on the figure of the woman.
Knock, incarcerated in the asylum, reduced to eating flies. Blood is life. Blood is life.
In Stoker's novel, we first encounter this character called Renfield in the asylum. Murnau has had the idea of introducing him earlier, making him the real estate agent who sends Hutter on his mission. Interesting change. Really, the only function of Professor Bulwer in the film is to reveal how little use and understanding of the world of logic is to the fight against Orlok. Bulwer compares his Venus flytrap with a vampire. But this knowledge will not in any way contribute to helping to vanquish the vampire. It's almost as if Murnau was underlining the uselessness of Bulwer's way of seeing the world. Tim Lucas, editor of Video Watchdog magazine, has written a very interesting novel called The Book of Renfield, in which he basically retells the whole story of Dracula from Renfield's perspective. Because when you think about it, it must be a fascinating backstory. How did these characters, Dracula and Renfield in the novel, Orlok and Knock in the film, first make contact with each other? There's no logical way they could have done. They seem to have exchanged these strange documents.
Now here is a scene that only turned up in the photoplay productions restoration that Kevin Brownlow did a decade ago, and the croquet scene on the lawn. Both the sitting on the bench looking out over the Baltic and the croquet scene. These scenes had not been in the print for some 70 years. They don't advance the story, but on the other hand, the purpose of film restoration is to bring the film back as closely as possible, both qualitatively and quantitatively, to exactly what the audience saw on opening night. I think this does advance the story. It's an eerie image, it's forlorn, it's wistful, and almost inexplicably, there are lots of tombstones in it.
But none of them standing straight. Ellen is here looking out to sea, waiting for someone. Ostensibly, she's waiting for her husband, Hutter, to return. But as we will soon find out, Hutter is traveling by land. It's Count Orlok who is traveling by sea. So this introduces the ambiguity. Who is Ellen really waiting for? And who is her real husband? And as I said earlier, there's a bloodless quality about Ellen, which is not that different from Count Orlok. Hutter no longer displaying that frantic, childish energy, no longer dashing about everywhere. He seems to have been rendered somehow impotent by Count Orlok and his encounter with Count Orlok. Stressing, I think, the sexual element of the threat that Orlok represents.
Here is our first full view of the Demeter, the ship that transports Count Orlok to Visborg, moving just as imperceptibly as the ship in Taboo. Almost without human agency.
And just as at the end of Taboo, there was a contrast between the smooth movements of the boat being sailed by Hitu, the equivalent of Nosferatu. Contrast between that and the energetic movements, the struggle of Matahi to catch up with Hitu. Here there's a contrast in the editing between the movement of the Demeter and Hutter's struggle to cross land. Here we see that the announcement of the plague, the monsters of Murnau are often associated with the spread of some form of plague, either literal or metaphorical. In Taboo, for instance, Hitu is associated with the restriction on movement, which gradually spreads and overwhelms everything around it. It seems to me when a silent film is tinted, I mean, this is just a personal opinion, but it seems to me that the image loses a lot of its physical beauty. How much control in general will a director have over the amount of tinting or the exact tints that were used? If a director said, I want this film in black and white, would that have been respected on the whole?
Would depend on the director.
Yeah,
would depend
sure.
on the director's power.
But what I'm asking is, was tinting something that would tend to be imposed by the studios or the money people?
Again, it depended on who the director was. Sometimes the studio did it with no consultation with the director. If a director was a big prestige name director, yes, of course, he would have input. We know that Obligance decided on the tinting of Napoleon because the documentation still exists. Blue here, sepia here, At times, the studio would decide on the tinting, and the director had nothing to do with that decision. The director was, after all, a contract employee. He was paid to direct the film. He directed the film. He picked up his paycheck. Directors like Murnau, Fritz Lang, Abel Gance were much more interested in every stage of that film's presentation. The music, the tinting. They would either decide or be very involved in the decision-making process.
Here we see the perspective of the film gradually enlarging. Initially, Count Orlok was a threat only to Hutter, and through him to Ellen. Now we see that his the threat he represents, is affecting more people. It's affecting the crew of the ship. And this is preparing us for the eventual spread of the plague.
Count Orlok is clearly a menace to the entire crew. And we are about to see two or three of the most supernatural shots in the entire film. Look at the ghostly, transparent image of Count Orlok.
Now, what's interesting is that usually in films of Dracula, the cliche at the end of the film is to have Dracula crumble to dust. At the end of this film, when Orlok is exposed to sunlight, he simply becomes transparent. But we've already seen him transparent. So there's a sense, if you connect those two images, it gives a certain disturbance to the ending of the film. The sense that the threat Orlok represents hasn't really been defeated. We're told that it's defeated. But what we see is Orlok simply occupying another of the many figural regimes that he's occupied throughout the film.
The use of artificial coloration in motion pictures goes back almost to the first decade. Motion pictures started actually in the early 1890s. By the turn of the century, films were hand-colored, and then just a couple of years after that, the process of stencil coloring came in. This was an attempt to provide emotional coloration to black and white images, be it blue for night scenes, red for fires, sepia for indoor shots. It is emotional coloration. It is not to be taken as an attempt to portray reality as we see it. It's emotional reinforcement. And of course, they weren't seamless prints sent out to the theaters. Every print had to be physically bathed in dye. From the beginning of this tint to the end of that tint, there were splices, because that particular piece of film was dipped in this dye and then hung up to dry. Then the whole film was assembled. So every print that existed was hand tinted. Look at the figure arise, almost as if Orlok is completely affected by rigor mortis.
That's surely one of the most quoted images in the film. It's the actual footage turns up in several films that I can think of.
Absolutely.
In Roger Avary's film Killing Zoe, that shot of Orlok suddenly rising is intercut with shots of a couple having sex, so milking the image for its phallic associations.
Mm-hmm. Now we are about to see probably the most spooky image in the film. Right here, and its successor image, which we will see in a moment. Again, gliding. A phantasm, a nightmare image from our worst nightmares. The death ship has a new captain.
Not every version of the film includes these Activisions. The version restored by Kevin Brownlow approximately 10 years ago removed them. There are some versions that include them, but not all. Was that something that would have been just required in Germany because of the way that films would be screened one reel at a time?
No, I don't think they weren't screened one reel at a time. It's just a convention that German films used a lot in the first half of the 20s, in the teens and the first half of the 20s, that they divided rather as a throwback to cinema as an extension of a play, of a drama. It was a convention in Germany that was eventually dropped. But no, the film would never have been serialized.
No, not serialized, but I thought that it wouldn't be possible to have smooth transitions between one reel and the next. Maybe I'm wrong, but...
Breaking up a film into acts often had nothing to do with where the reel breaks were. I simply accept it as part of the tradition at the time. So many of the German expressionist horror films were broken up into acts because many, perhaps not most, but many German films of the first half of the 20s were broken up into acts. I have always believed that this was a continuation of, and perhaps an homage to, the dramatic tradition.
I must go to him. He's coming. But who is him? Ostensibly, seems to be taken to refer to her husband, Hutter. But by this point, we will clearly understand her to be referring to Orlok. I love this tree in the background. It seems to have almost an element of insanity to it. And yet it's a normal tree, obviously something he found on location. The way he uses these natural landscapes to evoke psychological states is simply astonishing. And here is coming up one of the film's most famous images. The ship suddenly intruding into the frame. The force of irresistible fate. It's a shot that will be repeated in Murnau's final film, Taboo. Except there, the ship comes in from the other side of the frame.
Here is one of the most eerily spooky images the cinema has ever given us. Look at the jerky quality and then the slow, imperceptible horror of the plague itself in semi-human form arising.
Coming up from below, as if from the subconscious. Literally, the return of the repressed.
Enno Patelas has talked about seeing this restoration with the original Erdmann score on it, and he was struck by how powerfully reinforcing the original music and the original tinting were, how much they reinforced each other.
Now here, if you see these images in black and white, it looks like Orlok is moving around in daylight. Now the version that was restored by Kevin Brownlow tints these scenes dark blue, and it's more, it's clearer that the scene is taking place at night. Here the scene has been given a light green or perhaps a turquoise tint. It kind of suggests the effect of twilight. There are all kinds of arguments for tinting here because the dark blue tint, while it more clearly conveys the sense that the scene is taking place at night, perhaps throws off the contrast somewhat. I mean, I understand all the arguments for tinting silent films. I understand that's what directors would have preferred. On the whole, I personally tend to prefer to watch films, silent films, simply in black and white. What you gain from the tinting seems to me sometimes to take away from the sheer physical beauty of the images. But I understand all the arguments on the other side.
Looking at this image of Orlok carrying his coffin through the streets of Visborg seems an appropriate time to mention that German literature in general was frequently obsessed with things spectral and horrific. If you look at German cinema up to this point, you had Paul Wegener's The Student of Prague. You had Paul Wegener's Der Golem, just 2 years before Nosferatu. Of course, you had Robert Wiener's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And you had several films after this one, of course. Paul Laney's Vox Figuren Kabinett, Waxworks. You had the great Conrad Veidt remake of The Student of Prague 3 years after this. The preoccupation with the spectral, with terror, with the horrific, perhaps never more successfully evoked than in images such as these. Watch as Orlok dissolves. Vague, insubstantial, and palpably more horrifying as a result. You literally can't put your finger on it.
In the next few scenes, what we'll see are various characters trying to comprehend what is happening and trying to use concepts of logic to deal with the events which rapidly overtake them. And what Murnau will show us is that logic can be of no defense against the threat represented by Orlok.
Many of the other horrific images in German cinema at this point were unsettling, to be sure. In The Student of Prague a student's doppelganger, his mirror image, becomes his rival and takes over. Unsettling, frightening, but in no way a plague or a pestilence. The golem is a clay figure brought to life in Prague by the head rabbi in his synagogue to protect the Jews from Christian depredations. A strong Frankenstein's monster type creature, but again, in no way a creature who is going to infect and kill an entire population. Caligari is very unsettling psychologically and emotionally because of its bizarre sets, but it is about a sleepwalker who kills people. Here we have something that is so all-pervading, wrapped up in Count Orlok is the type of plague that could have wiped out most of the European population, as it almost did during the Middle Ages.
A lot of German films of this period, there's frequent emphasis on the idea of the doppelganger, the evil double. I think it's worth pointing out that 2 years before he made Nosferatu, Murnau had made a film of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, called The Januskopf, tragically now completely lost. Well, Murnau was interested in certain structures, some of which would involve the confrontation with a double, a secret sharer, a doppelganger. This genre certainly enabled him to explore that interest. But then if you look at Taboo, he's exploring the same interest there with no hint of expressionism, quite the opposite, in fact.
The doppelganger motif, of course, continued into the talkie period in German cinema. Perhaps its greatest example is Fritz Lang's M, in which Peter Lorre's Hans Beckert is a character, but his doppelganger, this other side, this Hyde image to his Jekyll, is a vicious child murderer. And as Hans Beckert himself says when he's on his knees, he says, why can't you help yourself? Ich kann nicht, I can't help myself. Ich muss, I must kill. That is completely a fractured, that is a split personality, a classic split personality. And that theme is prevalent and present throughout Weimar cinema into the 30s.
I guess because a lot of the directors of Weimar cinema, and particularly Fritz Lang, ended up working in America for various reasons. There was a lot of German emigres who moved to Hollywood in the 20s, including Murnau, and then, of course, to escape the Nazis later on. But I think that interest in the doppelganger kind of fed into the film noirs of the 1940s and the 1950s, perhaps the influence of all these German emigres. Film noirs tend to be focused quite obsessively on the idea of the doppelganger.
After Nosferatu, Murnau made a string of films that were so powerful. Der letzte Mann, The Last Laugh, Tartuffe, and he made Faust. Based on those three pictures, Murnau was offered a contract by William Fox of the Fox Film Company in Hollywood, and Murnau was given a contract the likes of which no motion picture director had ever before been given, namely, you sign on the dotted line and you will have complete control. Whatever you turn in, we will release it the way you give it to us. And Fox lived up to that bargain. For Fox, Murnau made Sunrise. He then made Four Devils, also with Janet Gaynor, but that film unfortunately has not survived. His last film for Fox was City Girl, and he made it just as silents were giving way to the newfangled talkies as we came to know them thereafter. And Fox got cold feet. They shelved it for more than a year, and when they finally decided to put it out, talkies were already fully ensconced, so they brought in a hack and had him shoot some talkie sequences to turn it into a part talkie. Murnau was already gone. The talkie version has not survived. The only version of City Girl that has survived is the silent version, which was never released anywhere. And then, of course, Murnau and Flaherty went to the South Seas to make Taboo, and that was unfortunately Murnau's last picture. I think Nosferatu reveals a very clear European sensibility. I don't think that would have been very appealing to Uncle Carl Laemmle at Universal Pictures. There is a sexual overtone, an erotic overtone to Nosferatu that is much more muted in the Todd Browning film for Universal.
We can see the influence of the great European horror films in many of the American horror films of the 1930s. But I think that the main use that American horror films made of the European examples of the genre was that it enabled them to define horror as something that was somehow not American. And even in a masterpiece like Jacques Tourneur's Cat People, the threat comes from France, from a French woman. So horror, sexuality, these things always come into America from the outside. They are never of America. It wasn't really until the great American horror films of the 1970s that horror was redefined as something that developed within America.
The influence of this picture was very strong and very pervasive. There almost wasn't any influence, of course, because this was a plagiarization of Stoker's novel, and the Stoker estate, fueled by Florence Stoker, Bram's widow, immediately sued Prana Film. She won, and Prana was forced to agree to destroy every print they had in their possession and to recall as many prints as they could. Fortunately for us, fortunately for film history, not all prints came back. And had they done so, this film would have been consigned to oblivion. But because it wasn't, and bootleg prints went to America and elsewhere, this film has had a very long-lasting influence. Brad already mentioned that Werner Herzog remade the film with Klaus Kinski many years later. Several years ago, there was a fictional film based on the making of Nosferatu called
Shadow of the Vampire.
Shadow of the Vampire. And I would mention, as far as not so much an influence, but certainly an homage to one of the great supernatural films of all time, I would mention Peter Bogdanovich's first film, Targets, made in 1968 and starring an elderly Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff's character's name was Byron Orlock. Clearly, an homage.
So when did Nosferatu come back into legal distribution? And how did it come back? Were the rights cleared, or did the rights to the novel suddenly go into the public domain?
I don't really know, Brad. I do know that after the end of the Second World War, because of the fact that there not only wasn't a German film industry left, there was no Germany left. We've all seen the newsreel footage of flattened buildings and just hollow shells of buildings that have entire cities that have been razed. And at that point, the occupying powers turned over the rights to whatever subsisting rights existed regarding film copyrights. They gave these rights to a corporation, which we know today, Transit Film, to administer. And certainly by the 1960s, there were legal prints of Nosferatu circulating. Probably there were in the 50s. I certainly saw the film for the first time in 1962 or 1963. In America, they were legal prints. I saw the film in Munich in 1969. That was a legal print. I believe the rights were administered at that point by Transit Film. That was a gray area. Transit controlled whatever rights existed. Quite probably there weren't any rights that existed because most of these films probably were not recopyrighted 28 years after they were first released. But Transit Film had a vested interest in perpetuating their control over these commercially viable films. And they certainly claimed whatever rights they could. And, of course, they performed a signal service in making these films available. And, of course, it was some years later that archives such as the Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau Stiftung and the Bundesarchiv and the Cinémathèque Française and the Museum of Modern Art, etc., and the British Film Institute led the way with beautiful, state-of-the-art restorations and digital restorations of films that for quite some time were imperiled and might have perished.
And this film is now certainly in the public domain, which is why there are so many cheap versions of it available on DVD. But the transfer we're looking at now is absolutely beautiful. If you spend like £1 to get one of these cheap DVDs, you're not going to get anything that looks like this.
You're going to have a truncated print, run at the wrong speed, with inappropriate music, largely. You might, if you only pay £1, you might even get a mute print.
I believe this image was missing from most previous prints. Constantly we have people waking up as if the events of the film are a series of dreams. Ellen here clutching her breast, suggesting the sexual nature of the threat that Orlok represents. And you see this relationship between the two houses, it's entirely created through patterns of editing. And the window where Ellen teased the cat with the string, now there is the vampire outside. Which she will tease as shamelessly as she teases the cat. So Orlok will ultimately be defeated by Ellen.
This scene and the final scene are both very erotically charged. Ellen in her nightgown, Ellen welcoming, throwing the windows open and welcoming this predator into her bedroom. This is the erotic power of Dracula as envisioned both by Bram Stoker and also by writers who preceded Bram Stoker. Think of the short story Carmilla. Or was it a short story?
It was a novella. It was a
Novella by Sheridan Le Fanu, which preceded Stoker's novel by perhaps close to a generation, I believe.
Now, Ellen has just told Hutter to fetch Professor Bulwer, the equivalent of the novel's Van Helsing. And as I've said before, in the novel, Van Helsing will be the vampire's main antagonist. He will defeat the vampire while the woman stands watching from a safe distance. But here, the only reason that Ellen has told Hutter to go and fetch Professor Bulwer is to send Hutter on a useless mission. She wants him in a safe place, while she confronts the vampire by herself.
There is one of the most frightening images the German cinema, or all cinema, has ever given us. That frightening shadow on the wall, reaching out, grasping, corrupting. It's interesting that despite the changes made to the original story, this version is, I think, in most respects, closer to the Stoker novel than many later versions. Certainly the most famous version, the Todd Browning film with Bela Lugosi, wasn't really based on the novel. It was based on the stage play that was itself adapted from the novel.
Oddly enough, the film that's probably closest to Stoker's novel is Guy Maddin's film, Dracula, Pages from a Virgin's Diary. Maddin actually turns it into an opera, but despite that, it's very faithful to the novel. And here Orlok realizes that he's remained with Ellen too long. It's the day has begun. And so in a sense, Ellen has manipulated Orlok exactly as she manipulated the kitten at the beginning of the film. Professor Bulwer, the character who defeats Dracula in the novel, here this rather useless old man who has nothing effective to add to the fight against Orlok. And here we see the day beginning and the death of Orlok. But as I pointed out earlier, when he dies, all you see is that he becomes transparent, something that we've seen him do twice in the film. He's actually walked through a door with his coffin by becoming transparent. So although the film tells us that Orlok is defeated, although the narrative tells us that Orlok is defeated, we're left with a sense of dissatisfaction.
Dissolving into a wisp of smoke. A departure from Stoker. But remember, in the previous shot, we saw his reflection. Stoker told us that vampires do not cast a reflection in a mirror.
But the film doesn't tell us that, so we're not necessarily obliged to see that as part of the film's mythology.
That's right.
And again and again in Murnau, we will have this idea of the woman having to sacrifice herself to the monster in order to save the life of her lover. It does seem to me that Murnau is almost offering a critique of the novel in the way that he focuses on the figure of Professor Bulwer here. If we've read the novel, if we know the role this character plays in the novel, we can't help but be struck by the total absence of any effective role for him to play in the film. He's simply an ineffectual old man. The vampire has been defeated by the woman acting alone.
I am R. Dixon Smith, and
I'm Brad Stevens, and we're delighted to have been providing the commentary track for the Masters of Cinema release of Murnau's Nosferatu.